So here's a live running demo. You see up there in the URL, it's demo.fusion-reactor.com. So anybody could go run this. You don't have to have any special privileges or log in or anything like that. And this is a real server that's running on the web, and it's constantly getting some traffic. Now, let me just say, before we go any further, it's a synthetic load. It's just running basically certain requests over and over, and one of them is a very long-running request. So the graphs here depict probably not a typical environment for you, but yeah, well, let's just talk about it. So when you come into the FusionReactor interface, and if you get into it in your first time and it's not looking at this page, you might come in looking at the FusionReactor About page. That's usually the front page you come into when you log into it. But we're in the metrics, web metrics. And there's lots of buttons over there, and the buttons have sub-buttons. We're in metrics, web metrics. And this is like the home page, the best place to hang out. And by the way, if you like this and want to have it be what you go to when you open up FusionReactor, you can set it as the home page. This doesn't set your browser's home page. It sets it so that when you come into FusionReactor, if you don't tell it where to go, it goes to whatever page is set as the home page within FusionReactor. Anyway, so this thing is watching this particular server, seeing it get its traffic, and let's just talk quickly about this page, because this is the most important page. You get a real sense of what's going on in your environment just by looking at this page. And in fact, I'll tell you what, rather than show this, because it is kind of silly, let's go to my website. I thought I had that open, but I don't, so let me just open up another tab. I think I do. Yes, there I do. Sorry. Yeah, there you go. Carehart.org. So this is my website, carehart.org. It's just this is a little bit different. This is perhaps more typical. It's getting relatively light load now in the middle of the night. But we can see request activity, we can see database activity, and we can see memory and CPU. Let's start over here because these are relatively easy to understand. So this is showing two things. There's a legend. So the dark yellow is the CPU used inside of ColdFusion, and this is looking at the past minute by default. I can change it to the last hour if I want to. So I just did that, and you see it's just a little bit different, not that different. But anyway, so here's the last minute, and this is the most recent time on the right, and it's passing by on the left, so we can see up to a minute. And the dark yellow is the CPU within CF, and the light yellow, which is generally above it, is the CPU total on the machine. So at this moment, CF was using 1% of CPU, but something else was using 40%. And let me just tell you, you got to understand that, because sometimes you're going to find that the reason CF's got problem is something else on the machine is stealing resources. People want to blame ColdFusion, but if ColdFusion CPU is 10% and the CPU is like constantly 50, 60, 70% in the light yellow, then there's something else on the machine that's stealing resources. Maybe that's your problem. But anyway, so you can see the use of CPU within CF in the dark yellow. And then the memory, this is a pretty powerful thing, because while other monitoring tools also show you the memory, FusionReactor does something that they don't do. The CF server monitor and CFusion, for those who know about that, they tend to show the used memory and then the top of their y-axis of their chart is the allocated memory. And if you don't understand the difference, you might think you're running out of memory when you're not. Like right here, it's the dark orange says I'm using 280 meg, but I've allocated 512 meg. But my max is around 600 meg. I don't remember what it is exactly, but the point is, in FusionReactor, the top of the y-axis, the top number here, is your max memory, max heap, the heap in the CF administrator. When you set the max heap size, that's what this is. And my server, you know, I've tuned things and solved problems, so I don't need a lot of memory. I can run it 600 meg. Maybe you need 2 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig. But let me just tell you, sometimes you don't. So FusionReactor lets you see how much memory you're really using. And sometimes even in a 4, 6, 8 gig machine, you might see that you're not using more than a few hundred meg. So maybe you didn't really need all that, but that's another subject for another day. The point is you can see the memory use over time, and here you see it growing, 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 and in a moment it's going to go down, because that's what it does. The JVM keeps an eye on things, and it tries to clean up after itself, and that's another subject, understanding garbage collection and all that stuff. But let's just say it is doing some garbage collection. It went down, and now it's rising up, and then it went down, and it's rising up. But you know what? Let me just throw out here, one of the cool things about FusionReactor is you can actually ask it to do a different kind of garbage collection. What it does on its own is generally a minor garbage collection. We can ask it to do a major garbage collection, Now, some of you out there think, oh, we're not supposed to do those. Those stop the world. No, my gosh, let's not do that. Well, let's see this thing do its own GC in a moment, because the JVM on its own is going to do a GC in a moment. From what we've observed, it's about every 45, 50 seconds on its own. I didn't tell it to do that. So there it goes. Come on. Boop, there it went. And it fell to what? 255. So 255 meg out of the 700. But there's a garbage collection button here. Let me click on that. And let's see if it can do better. Does it fall even further? It may not. We'll see in a moment when that line appears as it recharts that. It fell a little bit, so not much. But I've worked with people where we've been looking at their machine and they had it set for 4 gig or 6 gig max, and it was humming along at 3 gig or 4 gig, and they thought, yeah, we need that. We really need 6 gig. And I'd say, well, let's click that garbage collection button. And by the way, when I click that garbage collection button right here, we can see that it caused a little spike in CPU, but there was no great corresponding change in performance. Just take my word for it. That rose to 350 milliseconds. So it didn't add that much burden to do the garbage collection. If it was even that, I think actually it was about right there, and I don't think that was even that. So no, there was like virtually no impact. So don't take the word of people who say it always, quotes, stop the world. Theoretically, yes. Practically, not necessarily. Anyway, the point is it fell to about that amount. And so it really is using that amount of memory. But I've worked with people where we did that GC and it was running along at 4 gig and we clicked the button and it fell down to 400 meg. They weren't using 4 gig. They were using 400 meg. But the JVM was being lazy about doing garbage collection. And you don't ever need to click this button. You don't need to keep up after the JVM. It would have done that garbage collection eventually. Sometimes it would let the memory climb and climb and climb, and people freak out thinking, oh my gosh, ColdFusion's running out of memory. But if it climbs and climbs and climbs and then on its own it just drops like a rock, well, it was just being lazy, and it finally got around to doing garbage collection and then it dropped. Or you could say, well, I don't want to wait and see if that's going to happen. Let me just try it right now. And I'm just telling you, I've worked with many people where we click on that button and within seconds it drops hundreds, if not gigs, of memory down to a very low number, and then maybe they didn't really need the memory that they thought they did. Now that's another subject for another day. If it doesn't drop, why does it not drop? If it does run out of memory, why does it run out of memory? We don't have time to get into that today, but I just want you to see that even without talking about running requests or anything like that, FusionReactor can already be of some value to you to understanding some things in your environment. And let me just say too that there's much more to the memory than what we see here. If I come over here to resources, there's memory heap, there's memory heap non-heap, there's different memory spaces. Let me just show you for a second. If I click on this link under here, it changes this from focusing on all 6 graphs in the last minute to this memory graph over several minutes. It looks like it's going back, okay, a minute right now. I can go back an hour and see if it looks any different. I can go back a day. And as long as FusionReactor and ColdFusion have been up, I can keep going back. I can go back a week. And my server has been up that long. And so we can see that in my case, memory's been humming along right around 300 meg on average. So I don't need to worry about memory. But the point is, this is the graph. If I had gone to resources, memory heap, that would have taken me to that graph. But I can also say resources, for those of you that are really into this stuff, I can say resources memory spaces. And now it takes me by default to this survivor space, which may mean something to some of you, may not. But if you take a look, here is the Eden space, and the old gen, and the perm gen, and the survivor space, and the code cache. And some of these may be of interest for you to study. I'll tell you, most people over-focus on this stuff, and it's not as important as they make it out to be. But I'll just throw out that the perm gen is one particular place where if you run out of perm gen, ColdFusion will crash. And that's another whole subject, again, worthy of another discussion. But the point is you can see it and maybe see if over time it's changed. I don't believe on my server it's had any unusual. Yeah, it's been pretty much flatlined. But I've worked with people where we found that that was a problem. PermGen was rising. So I'll say one more time, I went to Resources, Memory Spaces, and then up in the top right corner, there was a drop down. And some screens in FusionReactor have that sort of drop down, so you want to get used to looking at that. So I'm going to go back to Metrics, Web Metrics, because like I said, this is like the home page, this is where to hang out and learn a lot. So we focused on CPU and memory. Now over here, these are about request activity and database activity. And specifically, this one is saying, in dark green, how many requests per second are running. So at this point, I had 2 requests per second running. And in the dark blue, it's, well, how long did those take? And so those two averaged about 176 milliseconds. So they were fast. And then you can see some other ones running here, and they were really fast. Okay. So this is running requests and average requests per second, and this is duration of requests. And I'll show you a little more about that in a moment. And then this is database activity. How many queries are there per second? And then how long are those queries taken? Now my server, again, is pretty lightly loaded right now. So let's go back to that demo. It'll be a little more interesting. So here we can see it's getting, on average, about 3 requests per second. That's the dark green. And then the light green, the difference is these are running requests. All right. Now the difference is requests per second is how many did run. Every 5 seconds this is updating. And the dark green in the top left graph is how many did run on average per second. And it's about 3 per second. Now again, this is some synthetic load, and it's pretty much always flat-lined at that amount. So it's not like it would be in your environment. You might have 4, 5, 10 requests per second, maybe more. You know, you might be surprised. I see people's servers of all sizes every day, and honestly, several requests per second is not, it's not usually much higher than that, even a busy server. And now you might say, well, you're not looking at busy servers. Okay, granted. But I'm just saying most people's servers, I see a lot of them, and they are generally doing few to several requests per second. Now the request per second, it's just interesting. It tells you how much activity is on your server. But this light green, that's very important. Whether you have many requests per second or few requests per second, that's really not as important as this light green, which is how many requests are running. All right, so the difference is not how many did run, how many are running at these 5-second intervals. And this is going between 2 and 1, 2 and 1, 2 and 1. So there's always in this server at least a couple requests running. Your server may have none running. You never see any running. You only see them completing because they're completing fast. And that's depicted by this over down here. This is how long they took. And the dark blue is of those that did complete, how long did they take? And you can barely see 512 milliseconds. So on this server, the average request time of the requests that are completing is very small, hundreds of milliseconds. But I said there's this one long running request. And that long running request is constantly bringing the light blue, which is the average response time of the running request. That's constantly going up until it completes, and then it drops. And then it starts over again because there's a load testing tool that's sending a request every minute that takes a minute. So anyway, we can see requests taking a long time. We can see if requests are starting to pile up. Usually you won't find any. Sometimes you will. Sometimes that'll be an indication of a problem. And then this tells you the database activity. And on this server, of those 3 requests per second that are running, they do about 15 requests per second of activity, of query activity. And if you divide these numbers, you get about 5 requests per second. So in their environment, their requests are doing about, 5 queries per request. They're doing about 5 queries per request because 15 requests per second of queries divided by 3 requests per second of requests is about 5 queries per request. That can be helpful for you to sometimes to interpret that number and to tell somebody. Anyway, so this is completed queries, how many completed per second, and then the light green is what are running, how many are running. And usually you don't have too many queries running. You might have many completing. Folks I worked with today had about 300 queries per second running. They were doing a lot of queries, but there was never more than 1 or 2 queries running. And they might have had 20 requests per second, but there was rarely more than 1 or 2 requests running at a time. So that might make sense to some of you, it might not. There's a lot to take in here, so we can't guarantee that everybody will understand every word I say, but hopefully it'll all make sense as we start to dive into some things more. The bottom graph is talking about of the queries that ran, how long did they take? The ones that finished, that's dark blue, how long did they take? Those ones that completed, how long did they take? And the light blue is of those that are running, how long are they taking on average? And so again, this is going up because there's a long running query. And now we can see that this long running request is long running because it's got a long running query. So sometimes even without going any further than this graph, you can piece together lots of things to understand what's going on in your environment. And yet this is just the tip of the iceberg of what FusionReactor does and can do for you. So let's just see some of the other cool stuff you can see. When did the server start? What date and time? And how long has it been up? This one's been up 65 days. And if you look at my server, you might think that's crazy, but my server's been up 47 days. So you can have CF servers that stay up for days and weeks, even on Windows. You know, Linux people are thinking, oh, my Linux machines run forever. But even on Windows, Cold Fusion can run forever if you solve the problems that keep it from going down. Anyway, you can see other high-level information about how many requests are running, how many total have there been on this server, 15 million in those 65 days. On my server, 500,000 in 47 days. Remember, this is synthetic load being sent every second, a couple requests per second, so that adds up to 15 million pretty quickly. The average request time of those requests, and then things like memory and how many queries have happened, 72 million queries. If you go to my server, I've had 2 million queries over the 500,000 requests. So again, you can see it's about 4 queries per request. So that's all just good stuff, high level, what's going on in the environment. There's some stuff about recent slow pages and recent slow queries, might be of interest to you. But there's much, much more.